You're listening to Music Tectonics.
Welcome back to the main stage. Thank you so much for coming to Music Tectonics. Super excited to have you all here. This has been an amazing couple of days, and I'm so grateful to everyone for showing up, and I'm also grateful that we've had some great big picture speakers on this stage like Scott Cohen, Mark Mulligan, and now Cherie Hu is going to be here in just a sec. Cherie is an inspiration to all of us. She operates her own career as a researcher and writer following the same cutting edge principles we hear pundits telling artists to do. She owns her fan relationships. She engages across social platforms with authenticity. She's building passive revenue to scale using subscriptions, and she is always trying out something new. And now she's working on her first book. And today we're going to get an early insight to her research and thinking around this. We get to flip the entire Music Tectonics Conference on its head because Cherie's book is about what artists can take away from entrepreneurial and startup approaches. Please welcome to the stage, Cherie Hu. And you hear the crowds in the background. It's all cats, but...
Also, I was not expecting that hat. That was definitely a surprise.
You ask for more hat, you get more hat. All about the costumes, and even if it wasn't Halloween. I mean, it was so funny because Mark Mulligan, on one of our previous things, he busted out this, this early armor helmet, yes. And then he did it again today. He's a big history buff, so we just go with the flow. We're building our own traditions here. How are you doing today, Cherie?
Good. I'm doing well. I'm excited for this. Yeah. How about you?
I'm great. I mean, this is you're our final keynote here. We've had over 800 people register and participating in the conference, and we had 400 last year. So this has just been exciting. Lots of great energy, and you're exactly where I want you to be, right here, wrapping up our event for us.
Thank you.
So let's dive in. How did you come to this topic? I hope I articulated the topic accurately. How did you come to the topic of this book that you're working on, how artists could approach their careers as entrepreneurs, adopting some practices of the startup world?
Yeah, thank you. And yes, I think you summed up how I'm thinking about the book quite well. I think the inspiration for the book came from really what I noticed from the moment I published my very first article on music and tech back in 2015. I think also as someone who is relatively more optimistic about the future of music and tech, I noticed that there was a lot of historical and also like current clashing between the music and tech worlds. Some, of course, justified in the case of not paying artists and rights holders properly, but I felt like a lot of the clashing and like kind of the enduring clashing over time was due to the fact that those two worlds just spoke fundamentally different languages. They use fundamentally different words and mindsets for thinking about success, thinking about growth, thinking about like product development, brand development, all of that. So from a very early stage, I was motivated by the opportunity to maybe be a bridge between those two worlds and help those two worlds understand each other, not just in one direction. And kind of over time, I've honed in on focusing on artists for this book as the focus of that translation. And in particular, in the past 3-4 years, I'd say there's been a huge increase in rhetoric and in messaging around the DIY artist and the artist as entrepreneur. This is coming from all areas. People are saying, oh, it's never a better time to be an artist. It's never been a better time to try to start your music career and release new music. And in this book, I just take a critical look at, if we really want to take the concept of artists as entrepreneurs seriously, what has to change about the way that they run their careers. Sorry, everything from like the start of the creative process all the way to how it's then like marketed, distributed, monetized, and then also how like fans are engaged with as well. And my thesis is that a lot has to change and a lot of it could rub artists the wrong way. So just trying to like unpack that analogy and seeing where it's really powerful and also where it just breaks apart.
Before we move in, because I want to dig into what you just said about those different aspects of running their career, from creative process to fan engagement and monetization, everything in between. But to me, it feels like in the public conversation, there's a bit of a tension that exists, and you referred to that. But I'm curious how you reconcile that tension that exists between artists and tech companies, for example, as it relates to rights and payouts.
It's a really good question. I think with rights and payouts, it's also a very complicated question. I'm thinking, I believe it was on Monday when there's a group called the Union of Musicians and Allied Workers who had just launched this campaign against Spotify, demanding higher payments and more transparent contracts, et cetera. And they definitely weren't the first group to come out with those kinds of demands. But I think like with the reconciling that kind of conflict, it's definitely not a one-line answer. Like it's definitely not an answer of just Spotify paying artists more. With that situation specifically, Spotify has not been profitable for like 95% of its life. And if it were to start paying more money, it either would go out of business or the only way it could afford to do that is if it raised like prices for users or subscribers, which could potentially be a future. But I guess the point with that is that there's so many interlocking parts with, I guess, in the current system, just around how like rights and payouts work that can often be difficult to like communicate within an article. So I think reconciling that issue specifically is definitely a long-term, more like political and legal game than anything.
Oh, interesting. That's interesting to think about. There's not an answer to it. It's almost like a process. It's an ongoing conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So going back to what you were saying just before about the different aspects of an artist's career, creative process, say marketing, promotion, distribution, fan audience engagement, and then new models for monetization. Let's start broad brushstroke before we go into them. Where are some general principles you think artists can learn from the startup or entrepreneurial world that will apply to some of those areas?
Yeah, I think on a higher level, if you even start from like the basic questions that any business in any industry would ask themselves, namely, what product am I building and who is the customer, who is the audience, and I guess how do I reach that customer? Mm-hmm. I think even just starting with those fundamental questions, there are already a lot of differences between the music and startup worlds. There can be opportunity for cross-pollination. One example, the concept of the value proposition of a product. I feel like people think about that so differently in music versus in the tech world. I think like in terms of the value proposition or like the value that a given product provides in tech, it is very much customer centric. It's like what can I build that will add value to this user's life, and then is something that they like that is worth paying for from their perspective. Whereas in music, because it is very subjective and emotionally driven, because it is an art form, the concept of value, at least initially, it seems like a lot of artists approach the value as just like their own existence and their own expression. And this is actually an example of where maybe that this analogy kind of falls apart, or at least where there is a fundamental difference, is that I think if artists think in too much of a customer-centric way in making music, their own voice won't come out and the product actually will not be viewed as necessarily as good. So there definitely has to be a balance there. That said, I think one general like concept that the industry can learn from tech is just like doing more user research and like gathering more user feedback and doing more kind of like low cost testing of either like the music itself or of the visual brand around it. I feel like the music industry, like so many other entertainment industries, is super risky. You're spending so much money on creating this very emotionally driven, subjective product that you have no idea how it's really going to hit. Like many cases, you haven't really proven anything yet. So any way to reduce that risk without, I guess, diluting the creative vision around an artist, that's the most important part, I think is key. So that's where like user research, prototyping, even thinking about like the fan as the customer and kind of how can you create the most customer-centric or fan-centric experience around your music. I think there's a lot of untapped opportunity there as well.
Cool. Okay, cool. So that's some good broad brushstroke thinking. Let's start to apply it to some of this stuff and go through those different career aspects that you brought up and how you're seeing artists integrating these principles. What are you seeing artists doing to address the creative process itself through this lens of thinking like a startup?
So we've actually seen this, or I've actually seen this increasingly in 2020, because I think by the nature of the constraints of the live industry, essentially being on hold for the foreseeable future. There's been a lot more openness to experimenting with the recorded side and kind of how an album is rolled out. I'm noticing a lot of artists being much more open with making their creative process a point of engagement with the fan and kind of realizing. So actually, here's another example. I guess people who are watching from the tech world will be quite familiar with this, but I think the way that an album or a song is normally made is, I think an album in particular is done through what's called a waterfall product development strategy in tech, which means that you're kind of heads down working on it for several months, gathering very minimal feedback along the way. And then you kind of launch it at the end and hope people like it. If they don't, then you just spent and wasted a bunch of money. Whereas kind of the standard in the software world is more agile development, where it's like kind of done in much shorter sprints. You have the opportunity to gather a lot more feedback along the way, and you always make sure that you're kind of serving some kind of user need at kind of these much shorter time intervals. So I'm noticing the creative process for music going more and more towards the agile direction, as opposed to the very traditional waterfall direction. And this is manifesting in many different ways. I think a lot of artists and producers in particular do this with live streaming. I think that the trend of producers kind of becoming their own brands and building their own audiences has been a thing for a couple of years now, but especially in 2020, thanks to platforms like Twitch, especially thanks to Discord in particular, which integrates with Twitch. These producers are kind of building a community and building a proper business and making income around just their process, around just bringing fans into kind of their screens as they're making music. I think a way of that manifesting that isn't necessarily live is through these platforms like Splice. I'm noticing a lot more artists, especially in the past few years, being open to making like stems or making samples, making their core ingredients, which I think otherwise would have been very secret or like very exclusive, also much more open and much more a point of engagement as well. And then just the last example that's more in the pop world, I got to play a very small part in this series of Zoom calls that Charlie XCX held earlier this year. She decided to make an album totally in quarantine over the course of a month. And every week she would host a Zoom chat with fans, with the press, and also with her friends and entertainment, just updating this group on how the album was going, allowing fans to vote on album artwork, incorporating fan input into the creative process as well. So all those trends are definitely exciting to me.
That's interesting. As you talk about artwork and compare it to tech, it makes me start to think a little bit about almost like user experience, right? Like the music is the product, but then the artwork and the video and all the stuff that goes around it is like the interface in some ways. And it's kind of interesting to think about, how startups have to apply creativity to all of those things, almost like it's a seamless piece of the experience. And so as you were talking about that example of fans on Zoom giving feedback on artwork, that it just was an interesting parallel I hadn't thought of.
Yeah, and this is so in this sense, there are so many parallels between the music and the media or the news publishing industries, and that's a connection that I think a lot about as someone kind of with a foot in both worlds. I think both music and news in particular suffer just by nature of how the industry is structured from not being able to own so much of how the user experience works. I think a lot of artists can resonate with this feeling when, I guess, the context in which their music is presented, say like on Spotify or on TikTok, they kind of lose control over that, just as the same way that a lot of news companies lost control over how their articles were presented on Facebook or on Google, who were kind of eating up the majority of the ad revenue. So I think that's also something I talk about in the book. Like, is there a way to create a fan experience or an experience around the artist where you own a lot more kind of that whole journey that a fan goes through? Yeah.
In the chat, I just noticed David Barrett said, have an artist often market tested new material by playing it live and trying it out in front of audiences before recording it. Obviously not possible right now. It's a good point. I mean, that is kind of a way to iterate and get feedback. Although if you can do it online, you can obviously scale that kind of feedback a lot further.
Absolutely. And I think that's actually, it's such an interesting an almost maybe like initially contradictory point about the ways that artists have been doing this already. It has been the lowest tech. Like it's just been by meeting fans face to face. Just as I guess software developers would do like user interviews face to face or kind of one to one, but performing for them face to face and kind of like be able to see their reaction and kind of remember it in real time. And I think what this year has kind of raised for a lot of people is the fact that they never really thought about about ways to do that in a 100% digital world. I think they had taken that testing ground for granted. And so now there are really interesting ways that are coming up for people to embrace the same mindset online.
Yeah. Huh. So I'm curious a little bit about well, there's two things I'm thinking about. One of them is we didn't talk specifically about the album cycle, but it seems a little bit like you're talking a little bit about changing the perspective around you spend a year or two developing an album, release it, tour around it, and then start over or do some more songwriting and stuff and build into that. But when you're talking about testing this stuff, being more agile, you're really, and it's funny because it kind of parallels what we're seeing in just overall consumption for all types of consumption of content. I hate to use those words, but nice generic words, not very artist friendly necessarily. But like there's just smaller, and we talked on Music Tectonics a lot about how music's been sliced. Once it became digital, it became sliced into smaller and smaller pieces. So part of it's on the production side, but the other side is on the consumption side. You see a snippet of a song in a TikTok, and all of a sudden people are listening to 7-second songs. They're no longer, full-on songs. I'm just curious if you have thoughts on the chicken or egg kind of aspect of changing this perspective on the album cycle versus the song cycle versus the sample cycle or the stem or all those things. What's got us there? Is it just the technology, or does it have something to do with consumption habits?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting question. I think one fact that is always I guess worth driving home in these conversations, first and foremost, is that music has always molded to the technology of the time. Actually, I don't know if it's been brought up in this conference yet today, but
Nauman showed a piano roll and said that's a mechanical right.
Yes. Yes. Okay, that's a perfect example on the legal side. But also, it's like there's still so many albums out there that are around 40 to 50 minutes, even though there's so much freedom for experimentation and compression or expansion. And that's because the two sides of the vinyl record could host at most 45 to 50 minutes of music. And that's just an example of how a format, even over the course of decades, has still kind of imprinted in our minds what the ideal length of a given musical project should be. And so in terms of kind of the cycle shortening from album to song to sample, I think a lot of it is due to, I think that the payment incentives of these streaming platforms themselves, both the payout incentives and also just the user experiences of those services, where they're always nudging you to discover more music, and they're always encouraging you to diversify your listening as opposed to necessarily just spending time with the same album for a really long time, which is easier to do in a physical format world. The fact that royalties, a song that's 40 seconds will be paid out or accounted for the exact same way as a song that's 10 minutes on Spotify is definitely incentivized shorter tracks in general. And then you mentioned TikTok in particular. It is really interesting, kind of the direct line in a lot of cases between virality on TikTok and then subsequent streaming on DSPs. And so I think that's why a lot of labels are chasing kind of that virality and that impact. But then also on TikTok, you can have a totally viral video that's only 10 seconds long. And if anything, on TikTok, you're even more incentivized to have the highest concentration of entertainment per second. And so that's even more the goal. That's more matching music to the nature of the video, as opposed to necessarily drawing out a song as long as you need for TikTok specifically.
It will be interesting to see over time if people get tired of scrolling through TikToks all the time, or seeing the same dance moves around the same 7-second clips. And now it might be a pendulum swing to more. I mean, people in the chat are talking about, what about longer albums? How do you create a full piece of art? Things like that, which I think are totally legit from an artist's perspective. But I think at some point, from a consumer perspective, you'll see other stuff. And we're still seeing things being revealed about whether that 7-second memification in a social video leads to deeper listening. It certainly looks like it actually is, but it's pretty early to see. What about fan engagement? That's another part of the process in an artist's career. What new practices are you seeing emerge there?
Yeah, with fan engagement, so especially this year, I guess, like thinking about specifically the pandemic, how I think about it is that in a lot of ways it's like gone to models that are not new at all, and that have been around for decades, but then they're definitely new, kind of more forward-looking models that are emerging. So in the first category, on the older side, I think it's very amusing that buying music seems in vogue again. Like the fact that companies like Bandcamp have gotten like featured in the Financial Times and the LA Times, and they kind of like come to the forefront. I would say, yeah, much more than Spotify as a platform that artists are sharing to fans to buy their music directly and support them. I think in general, to bring it back to the efficacy of touring and how touring was such an effective model, both for fan engagement, fan research, feedback, and also income. I think one major theme that every artist and their team is thinking about this year, or artists who were like performing a lot and on the road a lot, is what is the equivalent of touring online? And in terms of checking off all of those boxes too. So not just something that can earn more income for the artist, but also that allows for that kind of direct relationship and that same level of emotional impact. And I think there's a lot of reckoning with the fact that kind of the dominant aggregation-driven streaming platforms don't really make the cut because artists can't really talk to fans through those channels. They don't own any of the data. Depending on their distributor, they might be waiting several months to get paid, or depending on their contract, with their label. So just any channel that is more immediate and direct and intimate at the level of kind of in-person touring, I think that's kind of the common theme around among all the platforms that have come up this year. So Twitch, I had already mentioned, that's kind of like one great example. And it kind of ties into our earlier point about like the process being a point of engagement. And if anything, like the value that the fan sees being less about the end product of the song and much more about the artist as a person and as a human being, and kind of the connection being the source of value. Patreon, which I guess I'm on directly, just that's a disclaimer, but Patreon has grown a ton also this year. I believe their music category alone has grown by 200% in terms of the number of artists on their platform. And also I think that the amount that fans are giving to artists kind of outweighs any churn that may have come as a result of the pandemic. So I think that's a silver lining. And it's kind of like ironic that like that is happening, like more fans are kind of willing to support in spite of, I guess, at like higher governmental levels, like the industry not getting that much support yet. And let's see. Yeah, I'm noticing a lot more artists like posting community numbers as well. So just like any of these channels that allows for that direct interaction, which is nothing new. I've seen it come up a lot. And then just like quickly in the second category, something I've been looking a lot into this year is the merging of music and gaming. I feel like as gaming comes more and more into the forefront of pop culture, like with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez playing Among Us on Twitch, like, gaming is like coming more and more to the mainstream. In turn, I think these game developers want to build a reputation as pop culture companies and as destinations, more social destinations in their games to just consume media in general. So that coupled with the demand from the music side to build more of these immersive experiences around performing and listening to music, that has led to things like the Travis Scott Fortnite show, which I think like left a really lasting imprint in a lot of people's minds, and just a lot more experimenting with other games too. Like Minecraft is a much more DIY approach to a similar concept. Roblox now is building out their music team. So I'm really excited about those as well.
So I'm curious about something. Is there anything else from the startup world that you think we'll see artists adopting more of regarding engaging fans, especially early in artist careers? Because I think, when you look at an artist that already has a following and a pandemic comes along and they need to figure out how to reconnect when they can't tour or, production changes and all that kind of stuff. But I think, an artist that's early in a career that maybe they're just building their audience for the first time. It seems like maybe there's something different there, that it's just like a startup, right? When a startup starts, they have no users, right? Are you seeing anything that makes a special? I mean, you can't use community to send SMS messages if you have no mobile numbers of any. Right. Are you seeing any practices there for folks on the early side of their careers?
So this kind of goes to your earlier point of artists probably not being comfortable with the phrase creating content or being artists as content creators. I think I had tweeted about this a while back and it caused a lot of debate, but I do think that a lot of artists, not all, but a lot of artists, especially those who've been able to build audiences at a faster pace in this time, have basically co-opted the model of social media influencers, of game streamers on Twitch into their own careers, which kind of to the point of, the agile versus waterfall strategy. I think a lot of artists took pride in or were also more comfortable with being a lot more private and kind of doing their process much more in private. Whereas I think especially by nature of the way that these platforms work and the way that their algorithms kind of incentivize content production, I've just seen a lot of artists just post a lot more online. And I've seen this in some, I think you can approach this in a way that works well for the artist. So a lot of producers who are going live on Twitch, for example, they don't really make a show out of it. They just live stream their DAW and just invite fans to ask questions in real time. That even alone can be super effective. I know some artists are launching these kind of either docu-series or scripted series that they're just making themselves at home on YouTube. And a lot of it doesn't even have to do with the music itself. It's just, I guess the way I think about it is it's not even just music marketing, it's human marketing. And if any way, that's even more fan-centric or customer-centric than normal. It's what is, what are my fans interested in that I'm also interested in? I'm everyone loves food. Why don't I start a food show? And a lot of artists have been embracing that kind of as a primary way of engaging with fans, whereas previously it would have been kind of just a side thing, a one-off partnership maybe, whereas now those things adjacent to music are really coming to the core in a positive way, in a way that I don't think is detrimental to the fan experience.
So you're kind of talking about this breakdown between the moment of musical creation and fan engagement. And I'm curious if you think that's because that's what fans want, or that's what artists want, or is there something else going on in society that's kind of creating this interaction at this other place in the kind of the career?
Yeah, I think as with a lot of things, yeah, there are a confluence of factors at play. I think a lot of it probably comes from pressure around the streaming model, which incentivizes, which rewards scale. And so for artists who I guess aren't able to achieve a certain amount of scale, maybe they do feel pressure to, kind of monetize as much around the music as they can, including kind of the early creative process or STEM samples, etc. On the other hand, there are a lot of artists who have been on tour, producers especially who've been on tour and just don't like that lifestyle and just want to be able to find more ways to make income in a more diversified way without burning themselves out to exhaustion. So platforms like Splice, especially, I think that serves that specific need. And then this goes back to Mark Mulligan's talk from earlier, the blurring between fan and artist, I guess, or between consumer and producer is increasingly blurring with the tools that are now available out there. This is a bit, I guess, adjacent to music, but I think TikTok is a perfect example of this. I've only made one TikTok video in my life, but even like in seeing that, the range of tools that they have available and the effects that they have to be able to make really compelling, like well-edited videos, it just makes that process so much easier. Whereas I think a lot of people would otherwise find it really daunting. And I think we've been at that point for quite a while in music too, where there's so many production tools that are available out there for close to free. There are a lot of kind of, I guess, AI-driven music tools that allow you to, release a song technically in minutes. So I think as more fans become aware of that opportunity, I think that does make them a lot more interested in kind of learning about how artists who do it full time kind of get to where they're at. And they can, if anything, resonate with the process more in the same way that, viewers of a game stream would resonate because they probably played the game before. I think there's definitely a parallel there.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. So let's go to another category. You ready for another one? Okay.
Yeah.
Monetization. How are artists approaching monetization in new ways, similar to a startup or an entrepreneurial mindset? What are the ways that artists are doing that?
I think it's the topic of monetization is more about mindset more than like tactics per se. I think so. I guess to like bring it back to even a question of why should artists think like startups in the first place? I think a major element of that is especially thinking this year, with like Kanye tweeting out all of his contracts, there's more and more awareness of the value of ownership and a full ownership. And just by nature, a startup or any, kind of small business has the luxury of, owning all of those relationships, with their customers, with their brand, with their experience. And just the path by default that so many artists are feel compelled to go down minimizes their control over that experience. So, it's like, the first thing I got to do as an artist is release a record. Okay, so in doing that, you're going to put your music onto Spotify where you have zero control over pricing. You're automatically going into this very commodified, landscape where multiple platforms sell the exact same products. You just accept whatever royalty rates the platforms, will give you, and you may wait several months to receive that money. And then you also have, I feel like gaming the algorithms on these platforms because sometimes feel like playing the lottery. And so you're kind of like you're playing the lottery in order to try to get exposure on these platforms. So when thinking about monetization and business models, just anything that allows the artist to control pricing and also to reach the customer in a direct way and actually own that relationship and be able to follow up with the customer is what comes first to mind. There are very basic ways to do that. I think just like, selling music on Bandcamp or creating a Patreon membership is a good way to do that. Something that I've been getting a lot more into this year is crypto. I feel like blockchain and crypto kind of had a phase in the music industry around 2015, 2016, definitely died out, I think, as these startups didn't really have much to show for themselves. But this year, as people are grappling with all these issues about, like the value of music, the value of culture, there have been some really interesting experiments with artists selling selling their creative works and like audiovisual works on these kind of crypto marketplaces, being able to set the prices and probably make a lot more money from selling their art on these platforms than they would get from streaming, and they get it basically immediately. So I'm really excited by kind of those more emergent models. And so with like startup monetization, it just goes down to like very basic, but in many cases non-existent concepts in the industry right now of kind of ownership and kind of direct-to-fan monetization.
Can you shout out any particular artists that are doing that audiovisual, crypto sales stuff or platforms that people can check out? Because if you haven't seen this stuff, it's pretty interesting.
It's really interesting. People have very mixed feelings about it, I think, just as people do of the art world in general. But so this whole trend is mainly emerging from an area outside of music where people are auctioning rare pieces of digital art on the blockchain. So there are these marketplaces like Super Rare, Block Party is another one, Nifty Gateway is another one. So they're selling, essentially what they're selling or auctioning off are what are called non-fungible tokens, or I'm seeing NFTs in the chat, which are the digital equivalent of a rare baseball card. Like you can't exchange it like mutually with another currency. And what's so strange is that like in buying these tokens, you're not necessarily even getting the artwork. You're just getting a token that represents, like one of the rare representations of the art. So there are many like kind of abstract levels to it, but there's a producer named Blau who's auctioned off a ton of different pieces of art on these platforms and made like almost 100K in a matter of a couple of weeks, which would be very hard to do on streaming. Another producer named RAC, who's also in the electronic world and has been experimenting with crypto for several years now. He's also, he's made his own community token actually that, in that case, is not an NFT, but kind of fans can kind of buy a token and I guess have a stake in the hype around RAC as his community grows. And RAC himself too has a stake in that. So yeah, they're kind of like rare art models, and then they're also more community-driven models.
It's kind of interesting because you talked about sort of how the blockchain crypto trend was really a large part of our conversation in music 5 some years ago, and then it kind of disappeared. And what I hear you saying, I mean, what I thought the criticism, and we had that blockchain cage match at our conference last year, sort of like say, all right, guys, what's going to happen here?
Yes.
Who's right, or how are we going to move these conversations closer? But it seemed like the issue there was it didn't seem like there was infrastructure for enough people to be using cryptocurrency to really see that artists would be being paid through cryptocurrency and so forth. It just seemed like an esoteric thing that everybody in society would have to adopt more before Spotify could pay out in crypto, or track use could be tracked on the blockchain in that way. There just wasn't, the wires weren't hanging out from the DSPs to do that, or from the publishers or the labels or the any of the rights organizations. But what you're saying is it's kind of like, okay, well, that got put aside and you just started to treat it like rare art, and all of a sudden when you could raise the value of it, you don't need that many micro exchanges for it to be a viable market.
Yeah, and exactly. And it goes back to, I guess, this more philosophical question of like, what is the value of the music that I'm putting out, and who is setting that, and to what extent do I control that? I feel like crypto is not the only example of this, but it's one very powerful example of how both, I guess, artists and fans can have a much more direct impact on setting the price or like the market value of that work, and artists actually receiving that market value, as opposed to in many cases kind of seeing it go off from the secondary market without their involvement. So yeah, I think in 2020 and also beyond in 2021, hopefully there will be more models that allow artists to kind of set the value of their music.
I mean, what I hear you really saying is, if you extract the value of the music for the fan away from just a fraction of a penny stream, and you put it with something else, something visual, a community-based experience, a Zoom call, a Discord channel, a Patreon subscription model, a live stream concert, all of a sudden you immediately say, we're not playing the game of micro pennies here, fractions of pennies. We're playing the game of an entire user experience that immediately raises the dollar value of each of those interactions.
Yeah, exactly. And like, in those cases that you mentioned as an example, the value is not just the song, it's like the after effects. Like, what are you doing to kind of engage in and build the best experience around the after effects, around the fact that so many fans of, given artist music probably are going through the same things as each other. How can they, connect through that? I feel like those kinds of fan-to-fan interactions are also definitely underutilized.
All right, one thing that I haven't heard anyone ask you about, and you're hard to keep up with, you're very prolific, but I haven't heard anyone ask you about is how you walk the talk. It's the same approach we've tried to take with Music Tectonics, and one of the reasons I'm excited to have you closing our conference with this fireside chat with me is because of that. In the music industry, we're always talking about fan engagement and interactivity, but we didn't just want to talk about it at the conference. We wanted people to experience it. The chats have been really active, more like a Twitch stream to me than a conference one, super engaging versus a pre-recorded webinar where you can't really interact. And I've noticed panelists are even leaning into the chat just like a gamer or a live streaming artist would. They're not waiting until the end to take questions. It's more like a real-time conversation. And the same goes for the speed networking we've done with integrating between every session. Similarly, we've had panels on gaming and mixed reality, but we're going to have this closing party where people can actually experience what it's like to be in a metaverse, which is a very different impact on your understanding than just hearing about it. So here we are with you, constantly exploring what artists can be doing to improve their careers and businesses. And you're running your writing career like an artist. You're trying all sorts of fan engagement and monetization approaches. Is this a conscious effort? I assume it is.
Yeah, it is. I'm really glad you mentioned that. Yeah, I don't necessarily. I've talked about this with some people, and some people disagree, but I don't necessarily think of myself as an artist per se. I'm definitely like a researcher first and foremost. I'm here to provide more analytical insight and knowledge to the audience, I guess, to the quote unquote fan base, reader base that I have. But absolutely in figuring out what the first step was going to be for monetizing my newsletter, Water and Music, and for building my own community and audience. Honestly, so from the very beginning, that was the impetus for launching my own newsletter before even thinking about monetizing it. Is because realizing that unless you kind of set that up yourself as a freelance writer, yes, publications commission you to write pieces that reach large audiences, but you don't own that relationship. It's still their audience and kind of their ad revenue that they're going to make, off of your article. And then I guess on the monetization side, I definitely was inspired by Bandcamp and setting up a pricing model for my membership. I saw the power of the pay what you want model and the fact that a lot of fans, if you give them choice, will actually contribute more instead of just locking them into one model. So that's why the prices for my membership are anywhere from $3 a month to $200 a month with a wider range of benefits. I think in media, what is missing, especially from, I guess on the industry facing side, is baking kind of the community and reader experience into the actual editorial and reading, the actual editorial experience and the business model. I think given that, organic networking and relationship building is so important in the music industry, I kind of wanted to offer space for like-minded people in music and tech to kind of talk through those issues, kind of with that shared layer of reading the articles that I was publishing. So if you told me that I would be running my reader community largely on Discord last year, I would be a little bit confused, how would I do that? But it's actually been super effective. I've been hosting, weekly hangouts with readers in the Discord server as well. I guess all that to say, I've to kind of taken inspiration from what I've seen in the music world, seeing that actually the media world is just as, if not even more behind on a lot of the challenges that the industry is facing in music, and trying to build a career where it could check off all those boxes. And the kind of the Patreon Discord newsletter combination is it's worked
cool.
Really well.
I just love how you do that. You're experimenting, you're writing about it, you're integrating into your own career, you're walking the talk, which is super cool. I love it. Hey, when is the book out?
Thank you. Oh gosh, if it all goes well, probably late 2021. It'll be a slightly delayed publishing cycle, but aiming for fall 2021.
Do we have a title yet?
I initially said the artist as technology, but that is maybe a bit too literal for what I'm going for. So maybe it'll definitely have the words artist and startup in it.
Yeah.
So I don't have a solid answer yet.
And as we wrap up this 2-day conference, are you have any other final parting words for the Music Tectonics community?
Oh gosh, final parting words. I would say, I guess this isn't music tech specific, but election day is next Tuesday. To each their own, but I would highly encourage you to vote if you haven't already. If you're planning on doing a mail-in ballot, hand it in person. Super important, no matter where you're living. For something more industry specific, I guess, oh gosh. I guess so something that I also try to, I guess, impart in my work is like more interdisciplinary thinking. I guess it is like kind of the foundation of this book, but I've learned so much in the past 5 years from studying other industries. And I would just encourage everyone listening here. Many of you are probably doing that already if you're attending this conference, but look at what the gaming industry is doing, the film industry, kind of fashion and beauty industries. And I think there's so much you could learn from those kinds of businesses that could unlock, so many new kinds of opportunities for fan engagement. And
awesome. This has been great, Cherie. Thanks so much for joining us. Closing up Music Tectonics. Will you join us at the after party in Degi World right after this? Awesome.
Yes.
So you guys who have
I'll be there for at
questions,
least
come find Cherie in Degi World. Thank you so much, Cherie. Okay, folks, that's it. Thanks again to our Supernova sponsors, AdRev, Linkfire, StageIt, and Super Hi-Fi. Download the Music Tectonics app where we'll post all the video from our sessions. You couldn't go to all of them, but as an attendee of the conference, you will get access to every video that we successfully recorded through Hopin. Listen to my podcast, Music Tectonics. We put it out every week. Can I get a big whoop whoop for our marketing director and de facto technical director, Eleanor Rust? And how about my world-class assistant, Shaylee Ankenbrook? I couldn't have done this without these guys. They're amazing, so amazing. And I must shout out the entire amazing Rock, Paper, Scissors team. They are my pride and joy. Thank you, Alexa, Christine, Jade, James, Jeff, Macy, Sarah, Cheryl, Tina, Tristra, Zainab, Antonia, all of you. Thank you so much. As you can see, they're pros, and it's such a pleasure to work with them every day. The only thing left to do is go to the closing party in Degi World.
You're listening to Music Tectonics.